Salve Regina, Mater misericordiae, vita dulcedo, estes nostra salve.
The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. When the Pharisees with some scribes who had come from Jerusalem gathered around Jesus, they observed that some of his disciples ate their meals with unclean, that is, unwashed hands. For the Pharisees, and in fact all the Jews, do not eat without carefully washing their hands, keeping the tradition of the elders. And coming from the marketplace, they do not eat without purifying themselves. And there are many other things that they have traditionally observed, the purification of cups and jugs and kettles and beds. So the Pharisees and the scribes questioned him, "Why do your disciples not follow the traditions of the elders, but instead eat a meal with unclean hands?" He responded, "Well did Isaiah prophesy about you hypocrites, as it is written, this people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines human precepts. You disregard God's commandments, but cling to human traditions." He went on to say, "How well you have set aside the commandment of God in order to uphold your traditions. For Moses said, 'Honor your father and mother,' and whoever curses father or mother shall die. Yet you say, if someone says to father or mother, 'Any support you might have had from me is korban,' meaning dedicated to God, you allow him to do nothing more for his father and mother. You nullify the word of God in favor of your tradition that you have handed on, and you do many other such things." The Gospel of the Lord. When you look at the list of things that Jesus was talking about that the Pharisees seemed to be obsessive about, in truth, the Jewish rules of purification were actually cutting edge of just good hygiene, and they didn't even know it. They had no understanding of microbiology and all that stuff. But today we know if you don't keep your bed clean, you'll get bed bugs. If you don't wash your dishes, you're going to be running to the bathroom often the next day, probably because of some bacteria that you ingested because your food wasn't clean from a dirty plate. And so God gives these laws to his people to help them live in a good and wholesome fashion. And somehow they have lost sight of this. And I want to focus in on one of these laws that sort of gets by us. In the Old Testament here, in the book of Genesis, we're told that after God created man, the pinnacle of his creation, pat yourself on the back, okay? Very good, okay? That's not a lack of humility, that's understanding truth. God did something fantastic with me, okay? So God creates the man and the woman, and this is the greatest thing he's done. And he's so pleased with this, and when he's done, it says, he rested. Evening came, morning followed the sixth day. And since on the seventh day he was finished with the work he had been doing, he rested on the seventh day from all the work that he had undertaken. And so he blessed the seventh day and made it holy. What does that mean? By making that day holy, he set it apart. It wasn't to be like all the other days. He blessed it and he made it holy. This was the day that he wanted to just look at everything he created and have delight, especially in his two dear children, Adam and Eve, who he had put in this garden. And it would also be a day for Adam and Eve to delight in Daddy. And so the Sunday, the seventh day, became this time for Adam and Eve and God the Father to gaze at each other and enjoy each other's company. It became a time to put the work aside because they were created to work, okay? But it became a time to put the work aside and enjoy one another. It also became a time to put the work aside and experience the blessings, because he blessed the day. It was a time to experience blessing and contemplate the blessings that God was giving them. In other words, Adam and Eve had that day so that they could appreciate what God had done. And why would God feel the need to make sure they had time to appreciate? Because the serpent was already in the garden. And God wanted to make sure that him and Adam and Eve had this relationship, so when something tried to come between them, they could have this relationship where they could endure any attempted violations to their family. And so we come together on Sundays as a Christian community to guard our family. But there's another aspect of this. It's the time to have what we call leisure, a time not necessarily of laziness, but a time of leisure to enjoy each other and to enjoy God's creation. One of the things I was thinking of that could have potentially violated the Sabbath, you could say, in the house that I grew up in, Sundays, my dad didn't work. We had our family had a 3-tenement apartment house, and I remember 3 years in a row working all summer with my dad putting siding on that house. We did it ourselves. We didn't have a contractor. 3 tenements, okay? And my brothers and I helped my dad, and it took 3 years to finish the project. My dad never did anything on that house on Sundays. Never. That was the day that we worked with the family, that we spent time with the family. However, there's one thing that he did that could have been considered work. On Sunday afternoons, he would put on, one Sunday a month, he would put on a stack of opera records. Some of you don't know what a record is. I understand that. But he'd put not today they call it vinyl. He'd put a stack of about 6 or 7 vinyl records on the turntable, and he'd play opera music, and he'd pull all his boys into the dining room, and we'd have to wait one at a time for our haircut. Until I went into the seminary, my dad is the one who cut my hair. And in a sense, that could have been a type of work, but it was interesting that was a time that my dad spent with his boys one at a time. That was one of those occasions. And so we would sit in the chair, when we were little, a stack of encyclopedias to make us high enough, and we would sit in the chair in front of the mirror in the bathroom, and he'd cut our hair with the barber tools that he inherited from my grandfather. And at first, we all got haircuts even worse than this. As the hair gets thinner, you have to cut it shorter because it doesn't look so great. Anyways, but it was and on one hand, it was time of work, but it was time of relationship. And it was a time of spending time with Daddy that my brothers and I treasured. Now, my sister, well, my dad wasn't about to cut her hair. However, that was between her and my mom. That was their time. And so the Sabbath becomes a time to cherish one another, and it becomes a time to cherish God, and it becomes the time for us to have the leisure to contemplate the beauty of creation and the splendor and the wonder of our living God. It's not something we should take lightly. A culture that doesn't have sufficient leisure especially for the highest form of leisure, which I'll tell you what it is in a minute. But a culture that doesn't have time for leisure becomes so busy, it becomes obsessed with materialism and taking delight in sensory satisfactions which leave us empty, instead of learning to enjoy the presence of God and one another in a beauty of relationships. And the highest form of leisure, by the way, they would say, is worship, where you take the time to do nothing but gaze upon God. That is the highest form of leisure. It's the highest form of leisure because this is what we will be doing in heaven, a constant exchange of enjoying the beauty and the splendor of the living God and the grandeur of all creation.
Regina Celi, letare, alleluia, qui atque meruisti portare, alleluia.